number that is on. And then I will do the Dharma talk. And this week's Dharma talk, I will do that. And then we will continue with a reading together. And I will mention what page that's on. And then there will be the discussion. If you look into the chatting column, you'll see that there's a PDF and it says Jodo Shinshu Services. If you double click on that, that will open up to the Hawaii service book. And I will let you know what pages that we'll be utilizing in that tonight. And I'd like to thank Michael very much for helping me with the technical aspects last week. Trying to do everything. Thank you, Michael. Trying to do everything and be composed was a little difficult. So this way I can concentrate on the discussion and on the Dharma talk. So tonight, let's start with the silent meditation. If you could put your feet firmly on the floor and sit erect and listen to the gong. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namadots, Namadots, Namadots. Okay. So tonight we're going to be chanting the Sambutsuge. It's in the PDF on page 46. Bogen gege ije mogok nyoze enmyo muyo tosha nichi gatsu mani shuko enmyo kai shitsu onpe yunyaku jumyok nyorai yogen chose murin shogaku dainyan koru jippo kaimon shojin Sammai Chie Itoku Muryo Shusho Keu Jintai Zennen Shobutsu Hokai Gujin Jinno Kugo Gaitai Mumyo Yokunu Seison Yomu Ninno Shishi Chintoku Muryo Kuku 古代知恵人名光明一層神道大戦我が差物在所法可動生じ未不下脱不正上位解任精進尿税三昧知恵以上合成特物不行志願一切空空一切大安決し有物百千六万無料大小収入五者供養一切死と小物不尿愚道検証不逆異尿五者小物世界不不影無種鮮度光明師匠変死小国尿税精進偉人難量量が差物国土第一五種奇妙道場調節国尿内安任務闘争ガト愛民道脱一切実法来生心熱症状意図学国経絡安穏鉱物信用税や心象おつがの日力小小欲実法生存知恵無下上量子孫知や信行軽量心死食毒中画行精進人寿不下願にしく毒平等正祭道本菩提一心往生安南無Namadots, Namadots, 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 Namadots. Well, thank you for chanting with me. It was very enjoyable. I'd like to do a Dharma talk about a simple subject that we talk about in Buddhism quite a bit, but not so much in Jodo Shinshu, and that is the concept of karma. Karma is a key component to the basic Buddhist teachings, but ironically, in Shin Buddhism, we don't discuss it as much on a daily basis. And I would like us, when we explore the subject matter today, that we can understand why it's not as emphasized in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, though it is still a very important concept. Before we start, I'd just like all of you to take a moment just to reflect upon what you think of the word karma. As we well know, it is in our everyday American English vocabulary. And the word karma actually comes from not only Buddhist teachings, but also from Jainism and from other forms of in Hinduism. And they all have different nuances in how they interpret the word karma. So just take a moment to reflect upon what you think of what karma means. I think that a lot of us think of the more generalized form of karma, which is kind of like it's a fatalistic idea that somebody's got good karma or bad karma, especially us baby boomers that went through the 60s, oh, that dude's got bad karma. But that is a very superficial understanding of it. But I think that's what we hear a lot of in our everyday conversations when people refer to that. But as I said, the karma in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism are treated differently. So the idea about what does it mean in Hinduism, and I don't want to give these different examples to confuse you, because what I like us to do is hopefully by the end of my talk and when we have our discussion group, we'll realize that the Shin perspective is a different and an unusual form of understanding karma, and actually takes it in a different form, that our founder Shinran Shonin takes that idea of karma and takes it from this fatalistic idea to us having the ability to control our causes and conditions for our own lives. So in Hinduism, as you well know, existed in India and Nepal before the life of Shakyamuni Buddha. One of the things I think that's important for us to understand as Buddhists is that it was a fully formed spiritual tradition when Shakyamuni was alive. And he did not deny the existence of Hinduism. He did not deny their idea of cosmology. He did not deny some of their gods and goddesses. If you read some of the sutras or the holy text, the Buddha will actually talk about these different beings that they have in Hinduism. So again, because Jainism, Hinduism, and Buddhism all come from the same general geographical area and the same periods of history, they did pick up words that they use interchangeably, and karma is one of them. Now, I think when we talk about in Hinduism, it's very important for them to understand that it says the technical word is that is the way of the works, meaning that it is the essence of the universe. And that they say that the soul carries the burden of karma. Okay, now this is Hinduism. This is not what we're going to be talking about with Buddhism and especially Shin Buddhism, but that says it's carrying the weight or the burden of karma. Now, for this form of karma and the other forms of karma, we have to realize that this all takes place in the concept of samsara, birth and death. And that the Buddha talked about how that we can, through the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, get our way to working out of this samsaric existence where we do not have to go back and be reborn. Now, for all of us that are Shin Buddhists, this is kind of a concept that we don't really discuss because this is not what Shinran Shonin focused upon. But for us understanding our rich Buddhist tradition, I think it's important for us to realize that in other schools of Buddhism, a lot of the emphasis is placed upon doing good deeds to receive good karma, to create good karma, or to deal with the karma that they've carried from past lives. And so for us, and we'll be talking about this later in the talk, for Shin Buddhism, it has a completely different perspective. But a lot of people have anxiety saying that, oh, was I born with bad karma? And not to be oversimplistic, but I think it's relatively known that in some forms of spiritual training, especially in Hinduism, that if someone is born with a physical defect, then they say, oh, that person must have had bad karma, that they have come into this life with, they have this disability or this impairment. Being who I am, with my first minister in Fresno, who was 18th generation Japanese American, he agreed with that. He was Japanese, excuse me. And I said, well, because I'm from Seattle and they have a huge deaf community, one of the largest in America, and they consider that they have their own culture. And indeed, when I lived on Capitol Hill, you'd walk in the cafes and there would be dozens of people signing. And do they think of that as a disability? Is that something that's done? So we have to be very, very careful when we try to project on other people what this idea of karma is. Very early on, I can't remember which of the BCA ministers told me that, when it comes to karma, talk about your own karma. Please don't focus on other people's karma. You can't judge their karma. And it was a very simple but elegant teaching for me, because the idea is that I don't know what's going on with that person. And for me to say that that's their karma is very judgmental. So I thank that sensei that gave me that teaching all those years ago. So here we have karma that talks about that, I'm carrying this weight of the karma with me in Hinduism. And interestingly, for those that are familiar with Jainism, which has a lot of similarities, especially iconically with Buddhism, it says that karma represents the essence of life or reality itself down to an atomic level, was what they said in this one definition, meaning that all life is made of karma, and that is part of our building blocks of our existence. So you can see that how that has a little different of a nuance, but it is something that karma directly relates their possibility of reaching enlightenment or their life. Now, when it comes to Buddhism, again, there are many different schools of Buddhism. And so what I will do is make it into the simple division of the Theravadan, or the oldest school of Buddhism, and then the Mahayana school of Buddhism, which Jodo Shinshu and most practicing Buddhists in the world follow. And so in Theravadan Buddhism, the idea is that literally for you to reach enlightenment, you have to be a monk. And that means, of course, all these previous lives, these previous rebirths, is that the idea is that you finally come back as a male. I'm sorry for any of the females, I don't agree with this concept, but that's the idea, is that you come back as a male, you come back as a monk, and then you're able to do the practices and go through like Shakyamuni Buddha did and realize enlightenment. Now, it's not as cut and dry as it sounds, because there's this whole intricacy of how the lay people, how the nuns support the monks. So everybody looks up to the monks in the community. And so the lay people are saying, we will help you reach enlightenment because we hope in the future that we'll be able to reach enlightenment. Again, a very different concept than what we have in Jodo Shinshu Buddhism, which is the Mahayana Buddhism. But to talk about how, because when people talk about karma and reincarnation literally, it's a little difficult for me to not comprehend. I can understand it intellectually, but in my life, it's hard for me to incorporate that. And I'll give a great example of that. When I went to our seminary, the Institute of Buddhist Studies, I lived with Bhante, who was a monk from Sri Lanka, and I also lived with Dong Ho, which was a Korean nun from Korea. And so it was interesting how we would interface. And so I was the dorm manager. So that means I had actual responsibilities of dumping trash and collecting rent and different things. So if someone wanted privacy, I still had to interface with them. And Dong Ho moved in, a very intelligent woman, was working for her PhD because she had the English skills. That's how bright she was. And then after a few months, she stopped talking to me, which was awkward because I was the dorm manager. And so I talked to a confidant, which was one of the professors at IBS. And she says, oh, Dong Ho feels very bad about that. She thinks that you're a nice person, but you were very mean to her in a past life. She is scared of you. And I really was taken aback. This is only 15 years ago, right? And so that idea that in her belief system, that idea of karma is so literal was really eye-opening for me. And unfortunately, literal in the sense that she didn't like me because of our past experiences. So it was nice for me to know that because I gave her space, obviously. And then we continue to work. But the idea that she says, oh, I like her, and it probably hurts his feelings, but we have this bad experience in our past life. So again, talking about karma, that is a very Buddhistic way of many schools of Buddhism looking at it. But then what I would like to do is I would like to point out how we talk about it in Jodo Shinshu. Now, talking again about another experience at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which was a very enriching experience for me. I studied there for 3 years. And we had a professor who was British. and he specialized in Pure Land Buddhism. So it was very interesting teaching classes from this person who had a very British outlook on life and a British paradigm. I'll just tell a really quick story because this is true, and I think this is absolutely fascinating. So I was visiting him at his house because unfortunately he was in poor health. So myself and other students would go to his house for classes. And in his one room, he had an altar. On one end was a Catholic altar with Mother Mary, and on the other end was a traditional Jodo Shinshu Obutsudan. And so it was wonderful talking to this man because he would vacillate back and forth between both sides. And so here he is, he's British, and he was probably, in his 60s or 70s. So he was probably born in the 30s or 40s in England. And he had surgery on the dining room table. I hope not the dining room table, on the surgery. And he died on the table. And so he had that experience that we've heard about so much, so often. Obviously, he came back, he's teaching the class, where he floated up above the table, and then he saw the white light. But for him, the white light was the Pure Land. He knew that instinctively. It wasn't heaven, it was the Pure Land. But when he got to the Pure Land, you know what he saw? He saw beautiful rolling hills, green hills, with ladies wearing Victorian dresses. They were British subjects. That was his view of the Pure Land, which I thought was spectacular. But he knew, and he was very sincere. He says, I was there and I know with it. But the Pure Land for me was Victorian England. But the same professor, very sharp, a little intimidating sometimes, to be perfectly honest. And so I was there with Kenji Akahoshi, who became a reverend as well. Reverend Akahoshi is now retired. He was in San Diego. And so we go to this class and he goes, well, what do you view as karma? And so I'm sure that Ken could give you the official BCA line about what karma is, but it's actually cause and effect, meaning that, that the action or the deed, what you do as an action, causes a ripple effect. That's the effect. So for example, if you have a situation where you act in a pleasant way and then that other person accepts that, then that continuation of that action is a pleasant way. The same way can be said in the opposite. If there's a difficult interaction, then that can carry on in the future as well. But what I'm trying to point out here, and this is what Professor Corliss said, he says, do you guys really believe that's what karma is? So Kenji and I felt about this tall. But again, is like he's referring to all this other karma where, if you look up karma in the dictionary, there's pages upon pages and talking about the different practices and the different types of karma and the different levels of hell. And I didn't want to talk about those things today because that would distract from the talk. But even with karma, they talk about the different realms of existence. And even Shinran admits that we are very fortunate to be born in the human realm because that is the realm that we can hear and understand the teachings. So when he says, is that all that it is for you for karma? I was driving to class, he lived about 40 minutes out of Berkeley. And so Kenji and I were driving back and we talked about it. And Kenji was born into Jodo Shinshu. He's Sansei, third generation Japanese American. He was born into the tradition. And he says, well, I like the idea that it's causes and conditions. It's something that we have influence over, that it's not like this thing that I'm born with. It's not like I have this karma that I've accumulated from past lives, even though Shinran Shonin will talk about us having attachments. That's not exactly the same thing as karma, but we do have these attachments to things. And Kenji was saying, I think it's very rewarding that we can look down at our karma and say, I'm responsible for my karma. I'm responsible for my actions. And I agreed with him that, the idea that, that karma is something that we can look at. When we talk about mindful practice, we talk about trying to be present in the moment. When we talk about our actions, and then other schools of Buddhism will talk very specifically about mindful practices and also practices on how we use our thoughts. I mentioned in one of our talks a few weeks ago about the intention in Buddhism is so powerful. A lot of times, you'll hear that somebody says, the Eightfold Path, I will do right livelihood, you will not, take life. But the idea is not just following rules, like a list of rules. The idea is the intent behind them. And I think that's really a beautiful teaching of Buddhism, is that I can say to someone what I want to say, but if the intent is not sincere, it really, I would say in Amita's eyes or in the Buddhist perspective, it really does not matter. We all know that when we're in certain situations, social situations, my grandmother lived to be 96 years old, and I'm so fortunate to have had a real grandmother, bake cookies the whole 9 yards. And if she burned the cookies, you look her in the eye and say, "They're delicious, Grandma." And so the idea, is that we know to say the words, but the intent behind it. And then the intent behind that is that she cooked those for me with love. So it didn't matter that they were burned. So I was being sincere. I wasn't being sarcastic. And I think that in Buddhism, talking about the self-reflection and the self-direction, and also in Jodo Shinshu, is that when we talk about following the path of trying to understand the Dharma, and eventually we'll talk about Shinjin, but all these ideas that Shinran exposed to us about the idea of the Buddhist path for us to try to see things as they truly are. Now, I just want to address just briefly, because I don't want to get off subject matter here and make it more complicated, but Shinran Shonin does address the idea of the afterlife very clearly. And since I spent time on the other schools of Buddhism where they talk about the cycle of life and being reborn and coming back at different times. Oh, one of the other things about some of the traditional forms of karma is that if you do something horrible in this life, let's say you take the life of another human being, you might not come back as a human being in your next life, that there's kind of like this idea that you'll come back as an insect or an animal. And some of the sutras talk about it. It's interesting because they talk about that let's say, and again, this is taking things very literally, that they say that, so let's say somebody comes back as a horse. That person has the sense that they're not a human, that's their fate, is that they know that they were not born as a human, and that the idea is that to be a human is the way that you would do the traditional practice in order to reach enlightenment. So getting back to Shinran Shonin, he differed from his master Honen Shonin in the fact that he said, upon our physical death, we are released from the samsaric world and we reach nirvana. And that's easy to say in a sentence, but what is the meaning of that? So his master, Honen Shonin, had talked about deathbed rites. And I've mentioned this before, especially in the intro class, that the idea is that if you're on your deathbed, you needed to be thinking literally of the Nembutsu or the teachings when you die. So for example, if you were in pain or if you were on a medication and you're not with it cognizantly, you're not with it, then you would probably be reborn into, again, you would not go out of the samsaric existence. And so Shinran very clearly writes in his writings that there are, and he writes about the deathbed rites, that he does not believe in them. And that, as I mentioned before, Shinran Shonin says the idea of non-retrogression, that once we start this path, then it's nothing that can be taken back from us. Does that mean that we're going to be enlightened and perfect beings within our life? Not necessarily, but upon our physical death, we are relieved of that idea of rebirth, and we go back, as I've mentioned many times, about the idea of the oneness of the universe that we all come from and we all belong to. On a very special note, today here in New York, I'm still trying to get around New York. This city's crazy. It's so freaking big. It's unbelievable. And so one of our members, a wonderful gentleman who's 91 years old, is in hospice. Very active member all of his life. Actually was born in Manchuria, had to run when Manchuria fell. He's Japanese, but has lived in the United States for most of his life. And so I went to go to visit him in hospice, and he was the most delightful, happy person, and he goes, "How are you, Sensei?" He goes, "No, don't worry about me. How are you?" And so we're sitting there and I'm talking to him, and he has this wonderful life and he's sharp as a tack. And he's telling me about his childhood, and he showed me the picture of his brothers and sisters from, 80 years ago. And so then he says, "You need to eat, you need to eat." And here's this person, he's lying on his deathbed, right? He can't get out of bed, and so I'm sitting at the foot of the bed and they bring me some food and he goes, "Are you enjoying it? Are you enjoying it, Reverend Ryan?" I'm like, "Oh, yes, thank you." But the idea is that I have done this was not a Pelo service. This is not a Makoto Gyo when somebody's passing away. He's got some time left. But my genuine experience, without being naive, is that I've not met one Jodo Shinshu practitioner that when they're faced with death, they're scared. It's a very powerful experience to go to be with the family and to be with the person that's passing. But I really think that every person that I've met, and I've done probably over 30, maybe even 40 of these Pelo services over the years, they're all there and they're present and they're not worried about the afterlife. And I think that that's that idea that Shinran said that there's no non-retrogression. So when I'm there, they're more worried about what are my grandchildren going to do? My child, they're worried about other people. They're not worried about themselves. They're not worried about the afterlife. And I think that that's the beauty of Jodo Shinshu, that, we know that the afterlife is resolved and we don't have to worry about it. And what we're supposed to do is take our time and focus on the present and our interactions with each other. And like the gentleman that I saw today in hospice, the idea is that even at the end of his life, he's concerned about others and being hospitable. So again, getting back to this idea of karma, the idea that in Shin Buddhism, it's something that we have some control over, that it's our actions. We know that what we do does have ramifications. Maybe not with the person that we're even dealing with. We know that we can be in a group situation and what we do impacts others continuously. So I hope that today's talk will give you some insight in what karma is, especially in the Jodo Shinshu context, that it is something for us and that when we don't have to worry about the end life because Shinran Shonin let us know that we will be guaranteed to reach nirvana. Now, one thing I always poor Ken, I always look at Ken's picture when I'm talking because I always know because he's always very good at asking me questions. And so it's like the idea of like, well, nirvana and will I become a Buddha? Because sometimes these are spoken interchangeably, correct? And so like we all have the potential for Buddhahood. But in Shin Buddhism, we focus on reaching nirvana. And one of the things that I came across reading, Ken, that I thought of you was that, Shinran said very clearly, equal to the Buddhas, equal to Amida Tathagata, equal to Amida Buddha, but not being Amida Buddha. And so I think that that's that kind of nice nuance about the idea is that when you talk about nirvana, then you reach that nirvana that is the equivalent of the Buddha, but you're not Shakyamuni Buddha or you're not Amida Buddha. So I don't know, we can talk in the discussion if that helps or not, but I think it's a beautiful idea. So what I would like us to do is that concludes my Dharma talk for today. I'm sure, hope that we have a wonderful discussion group because people can talk about their view of karma. And if it is something that they feel is fatalistic, when we can talk about that. But before we do, I would like us to do a reading. So if you could look at the PDF and we will go to page number 6. And this is the Jodo Shinshu Creed, the Shinshu Pledge number 1 on page 6 of the PDF file. So if you could please join me. I take my refuge in the vow of the Buddha. Reciting the name, I will live life with strength and sincerity. I revere the light of the Buddha. I will put my effort in my work with self-reflection and gratitude. I will follow the teachings of the Buddha. Discerning the right path, I will spread the true Dharma. I rejoice in the compassion of the Buddha. I will respect and help others and do my best for the welfare of humankind. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Okay, just before the discussion, I'd like us just to take a few moments of silent meditation to calm our mind. So if you could please join me in silent meditation. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Butsu.